You know, if there was just one thing that I could teach to someone, it would be how to hear God's voice. And to illustrate why that's the case, I want to do two imaginary phone conversations. So, by the way, after I finish these two conversations, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourselves and make a couple of comments about this. So adults and kids, whoever, we want to give you a chance to make a few comments as you think about these two different conversations. So here's the first one. Hi. I'm so glad to talk to you this morning. I hope your day's going well. I'm so glad that you're part of my family. You're so smart and clever, and I just love you so very much. And please don't forget to feed the goldfish. I love you. Bye. That's conversation number one. Here's conversation. Oh, and by the way, these are not just about conversations, but these are about the way we sometimes talk to God. That is the way that we sometimes pray to God. Have you seen that prayer before? Have you prayed that kind of prayer before? All right, here's another conversation. And again, you might imagine that it's a conversation with God. Hi, I miss you. How's your day going? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And then what happened? Uh-huh. Oh, okay. And the conversation continues for a bit longer. All right, let's talk about those two conversations. I'll give you a chance. Please unmute yourself. I really would like some feedback. I don't have any right answers for this, but talk to me about those two conversations. What do they do? How are they different? What is the effect of each of them? When I was younger, I was taught to pray the first way. And I was taught some words to use.
I'm not there. Are you still there?
I was taught some words to use and you know, don't forget to include this and that in your prayer, but it was still very one-sided. And it wasn't until years later that somebody said, well, take a few moments and listen to God in the middle of your prayer. Let him talk to you. When I woke up this morning, as I often do, I had a little conversation with God, and he said to me, I want them to know me. That should be the goal of this morning. I want all the people to know me. And so I want to make that the focus of our time together. All right. Now, when you use a phone conversation, you only have sort of one way to communicate, and that's with your voice. Now, there are lots of ways. In Zoom, there are other ways that we can communicate with each other. Sometimes God communicates in a very general way. As we're growing up, we look at the beauty of nature, we see a sunset or something, and God is starting to communicate. Now, some people don't understand what he's saying, but he is using that to communicate. It says in Romans that we know about God because of the things that he has made. It says that in the Psalms and several other places. And so when missionaries go to other countries where they've never heard about Jesus, often they have this sense about a God, or sometimes when in the odd culture, they even know about Jesus, maybe not by that name, but it's because of the things they see around them, the stars and the trees and other things. And so God speaks to us that way. Sometimes he gives us a sense or an impression. And one of those things can be your conscience. That's one of the ways that God speaks to us. And how do you know that that's not your own voice? Maybe that's just your own voice. Well, the way you know it's not your own voice is because it disagrees with you. And unless you're schizophrenic, your own voice shouldn't disagree with you in that way. And so it tells you, oh, that's something from outside. God is speaking to you through your conscience. And sometimes God gives us something really specific, like when I woke up this morning and that very clear statement was on my mind. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. I want them to know me. And often God gives me specific things like that. And so this morning, as we talk about hearing God's voice, we want to talk about all of these ways. And some of you printed out the handout, and if you did that, there's a section in there called Some of the Ways God Speaks. And so I encourage you to have a look at that later. And actually, there's sort of a good kids activity hidden in there, because you can go through those stories and maybe make the short stories a little bit shorter than all of the passage that I have quoted there. But you should be able to find 12 to 15 different ways that God spoke to people. I'm not going to give you too many clues about those because I want you to have some fun with them. But there are lots of interesting ways that God spoke to people. So have a look at that. It's the section called Some of the Ways God Speaks. When I was younger, someone said to me, oh, there's some saints in our church and God speaks to them. And so what's the implied message in that? Well, he ain't going to talk to you. And so I went through life thinking, oh man, I kind of wish I was one of those saint type, whatever they were, and God would speak to me, but I don't know, I guess I'm just an average Joe, and too bad that's my lot in life. It wasn't until years later I realized that's not the truth. God wants to speak to all of us. And if you tell me that you're a follower of Jesus, then I can guarantee you that you've heard God's voice at least once. Because it says in John 6:44, no one can come to the Father unless I draw them. So you cannot follow Jesus unless God draws you. So God has somehow communicated with you to draw you. And you know, maybe you're playing at the beach or something and you go in the water and the water's a little cool on your toes when you start, and then you get in and it feels really nice. And your friend is standing at the beach and you're saying with your voice, come on in. It's actually really nice in here. And they put their toes in it. I don't think so. And then you wave with your arms, come on in, and maybe a splash in the water. These are all different ways that you're communicating with them to draw them in. God does the very same thing. Maybe with a sunset, maybe with something else, but all of these things are ways that God draws people in. And here's another really interesting thing. God talks to people who are not yet Christians. So if he didn't do that, they couldn't become Christians. Because they wouldn't be able to hear his voice. And it says that we are drawn to God by his kindness. And so you have to be able to experience and somehow know about God's kindness and connect that with the person called God some way, in some abstract or maybe not really clear way, but there has to be that start of a connection so that you are drawn to God and you come to know him. Sometimes the trick is for us to recognize that God is actually speaking to us. You see, when he speaks, he doesn't speak with a great big voice that shakes the earth and you know that God, well, he does that sometimes, but mostly you don't want that to happen because that might mean you're in big trouble. So you don't necessarily want that. But usually he just whispers and it's kind of like the sunset or something else, or a specific sentence that he puts on your mind. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that happens. But here's what I want you to do. And this is for the kids too, by the way. And I should just mention that kids actually find it easier to hear God's voice than adults do. I know it's not fair, and I'll take it up with God someday, but that's just the way it is. But kids find it much easier often to hear God's voice. And so as they're doing these little activities this morning, don't be surprised if they outshine their parents. It's okay. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to just think about one time that you heard God's voice. It might have been your conscience. It might have been something he was nudging you to do, maybe to send somebody a card or a note or something. And then later on, you found out that that's exactly what that person needed. So I'll give you just a few moments to think about a time when you heard God's voice. And then I'm going to give a couple of you a chance to tell us about that if you'd like. So we'll just take a minute to do that. I want to just, I was glad that as some of you were talking, you said that you had doubts about what you heard. You know, that's normal. Some people think, you know, you read the story of Jeremiah or somebody in the Bible and say, oh, God spoke to them. They knew exactly what to do and it all worked out, you know. But those stories kind of miss over the part that they were thinking about what they heard and they were struggling with what they heard and they were wondering, is that really God? That's a normal part of the process. And so by us talking a little bit about our own stories, you can start to hear, oh, I didn't know if that was God. And so you had to say it a couple of times to me, or I'm still not sure if that was really God. And right now I'm thinking, I'm actually working through some things and I'm saying, is that God? Is that not God? But I'm putting it on the table and I'm not throwing it away and I'm thinking about it and I'm wondering. And so that's how we demonstrate faith. It's that we say, I'm going to put this on the table and I'm going to weigh it and I'm going to consider it. I've got a little imaginary piece of paper with this on it and I'm going to leave it on the table until I sort this out. Is this God or is this the right time? And so there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know if that's God. But the fact that you're saying it might be God, that's the element of faith where you're saying this might be God. All right? Okay. So God wants to speak to us. And the Bible is jammed full of examples. And if you have the handout, on your own time later today, look on the first column of chapter 1. And I put a whole bunch of references there. And purposely, I included the very first chapter of the Bible and the very last chapter of the Bible, because God speaks to his people in both of those chapters and a whole bunch of places in between. In fact, there are more than 400 passages in the Bible that talk about God communicating with his people. There's 219 that say the Lord said. There's 46 that say God said. There's 160 that talk about voices, angels, dreams, and all kinds of other things. And you add them up, and there's well over 400 distinct passages that talk about God communicating with his people. Does he get the message across? He wants to speak to us. I'm just going to quote a couple of simple examples. The first passage here comes from John 10, which of course is the passage that Ajani kindly read for us this morning. And it says, he goes before them and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And then in verse 27 of John 10, it says, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. Could it be more simple? And that's exactly what God does. We know him, and we recognize his voice, and he talks to us, and we follow him. Here's another passage that I really like, and this one is from Isaiah 30, verse 21. And your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. When you turn to the right or when you turn to the left. It's exactly what Shannon described. A voice from behind saying. And you know, for me, often God reminds me about things. I'm getting ready to do something and it's kind of like a voice from behind me, but it's not really loud. It's more like an impression in my mind. And don't forget your keys. Oh yeah, my keys, you know. And often, God will remind me of things, or he'll say, take something or other. And I'm thinking, that's a stupid idea. I'm going here. I'm not going to need that. And sometimes I'll just put that thing in the car and guess what? Sure enough, it's something that I needed unexpectedly for that day. And your ears will hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Isaiah 30, verse 21. And there's tons of other wonderful examples in the Bible. And if you look at the handout, you'll have lots of reading to do this afternoon about all kinds of cool examples of God speaking to people. All right. I want to tell you a story. Just before COVID hit, um, Heather and Ben and I got to spend some time with Annie Blake and their little girl, Callie. So Callie is my granddaughter. And Mary, who some of you know, was also there. So it was a lovely extended family time together. And I just want to focus on Callie for the next little bit here. But it was so much fun to be with her and to play with her and to splash in the water and to chase each other around and for her to start learning the names of her colors. And we just had a lovely, fun time together. And you know, if I can draw a spiritual parallel to that, God is around us and he lets us enjoy the nature that he has made. And sometimes we start to sort of understand that he's a person, just like Callie understood that I was a person and that Heather and others were. We start to sort of recognize that God is a person. And as it says in Romans 2:4, we start to be drawn to him by his kindness. You see, Callie had a really good experience with us. And so after we returned back to Waterloo, she started to say, Dama, Dampa, Dama, Dama, where Dama? She wondered, where's Grandma? And she remembered having a good time. And so she was seeking, she wanted to know, where are these people? And it's the same with God. But to want to connect, you must have a positive experience. So Callie had a positive experience, and so when she got home, she missed us, and she said, "Dama, Dama." It's the same with us as we start to engage God and know something about God. It says in Hebrews 11:6, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because whoever would come to God must believe that He is, and that He rewards those who diligently seek Him." Now, sometimes people have had a really bad experience in life and they blame it on God. And so that can put a barrier between them and God. And they say, oh, I don't want anything to do with God. And sometimes our job in reconciliation is to help them to see that that wasn't God. God saw what was happening, but God was not responsible for that thing that happened. And so sometimes we can help people to see that God is actually kind and loving. And sometimes the things that happen are people's faults. They have bad motives or whatever. All right? And so that's sometimes part of the peace, is to help them to not reject God. Because if they're going to come to God, they must believe that He is and that He rewards those who seek Him. Now, just as my family came back to Waterloo, and so we were thousands of kilometers away from Cali, God, in a sense, is thousands of kilometers or more away from us, in the sense that He's in heaven, or even more so, in the sense that He lives in the supernatural realm. And so there is, in a sense, a distance between them. But the good news is there's a way to bridge these distances. In terms of the 2,000 physical miles between here and Calgary, there's a thing called Zoom, and it allows you to connect across those kinds of distances. And for us as Christians, there's a way we can connect with God, and that, of course, is called prayer. And so we can connect with God, hopefully through a two-way conversation. Just a reminder of the phone, a two-way conversation with God. And what makes Zoom work, of course, is the fact that it's two-way. I can talk to you and you can talk to me. Now, there's just one little wrinkle in this whole story. You see, Callie was about 21 months old, so she was really quite young. And so when her parents got out their laptop and set it up for Callie, and we did a Zoom call, she could hear the voice of Dama. But where Dama? Where Dama? Well, look at the screen. That's Grandma on the screen. Where Dama? Where? And it took her a while to intellectually get the idea of looking on the screen, because she knew grandma is about this tall and three-dimensional and dancing around, all those kinds of things. And now she's looking at this piece of glass on the coffee table. And it took her quite a while to get her head around the idea, oh, that's Dhamma. And her parents had to do a lot of coaching and say, to her and say, look, this is Dhamma. See the picture, see the picture. And she could hear the voice and she said, Dhamma, Dhamma, but where Dhamma? and she did the same for Dampa. And for Uncle Ben, she was always asking for Uncle Ben. And Uncle Ben is really long. And so it was Amam, Amam. And we had to know that that was code for where's Uncle Ben? And so her parents had to do a lot of coaching before she finally could make sense of this little glass tablet set up on the coffee table and make the connection. Oh, that's actually Dhamma, and I can connect with her. And now she connects easily, and she waves and reads a book and does all kinds of things with Dhamma when Dhamma is on Zoom. Now, it's the same in the spiritual realm, because people say, oh, well, God is this long ways away. So how do I connect with him? And maybe you can kind of say, well, I know he's there, kind of like Callie could hear our voices, but Callie couldn't make sense of the pictures on the screen. And maybe you have a little bit of trouble making sense of, well, how does God talk to me? And was that really God? And there's all these things that you're trying to figure out. And so my job this morning is to be kind of the coach and say, well, we'll just keep talking to me. Let's keep talking. We'll get this figured out. And you will be able to hear God's voice. That's what we're aiming to do today, is I'm going to be your coach and help you to learn how to hear God through prayer. So that's what we're going to do this morning, and we have a few more minutes to do that. Now, I should say that when we have these little conversations with Callie by Zoom, sometimes there's little misunderstandings. She says, Amam, Amam, and I'm thinking, Amam, oh yeah, that's Uncle Ben. And she'll use her words and we'll use our words, and sometimes we don't hear each other perfectly. You know what? It's the very same thing when you're talking to God. Now, as you do it more and more often, you get better at it, and the misunderstandings become less and less. But when you're talking to God, you always test what you hear, and we're going to talk about that in just a few moments too. So each time that we call Callie and her parents in Calgary, we develop a stronger and stronger relationship. And every time that you call God in prayer and spend time listening to him and talking to him and having a conversation, your relationship with him will become stronger and stronger. All right, let's do a simple little exercise. So I hope that you have pencil and paper handy. So ideally, it's best if each person has just a little pad of paper. You don't need a lot of paper, or even just a sheet of paper and a pencil. And I'm assuming everybody's disappearing from the screen because they're going for a pencil, not because they're unhappy about what I'm saying. I love this Zoom thing. I can see you, and it feels like I'm actually talking to you. So it is, as long as you're old enough to write and you can write just a couple of simple words, you can do this little exercise. So it's a really simple thing. I've used it many, many places around the world, actually, and it's just a lovely little example. So I'm just talking for a moment until everybody is set up and ready to do this. Now, when you listen to God, one of the best things to do is just take the very first thing that comes to your mind. And I'll explain later why that's the case. But I want you to just take the very first thing. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Ask God to put a color on your mind. And I want you to write down the name of the color. Take the very first thing. And if you don't get anything, then pick a color, just pick a color. All right, because I've been praying that God would give you the right color. And so, you know, if you need to do a little bit, if it's a little more manual for you to say, oh, okay, I'm going to pick this color, that's okay. And write it down. Now, ideally, I want you to concentrate on that color just a little bit. And if it's blue, is it light blue? Is it dark blue? Is it a little more towards the green end of the spectrum, or a little, okay, or a little bit more blue? All right, so a little bit more red. Okay, so I want you to just think a little bit about that color and maybe write down 1 or 2 words that describe that color. Now, I'll tell you why we're doing it this way. Often when God speaks to us, it works best if he gives us one piece and then the next piece and then the next piece. All right, has everybody got a color written down? Wave your hand or do something so I know that you've got your color written down. Okay, good, good. I see some kids with their arms in the air. Perfect. All right. Now, I want you to ask God, why did he give you that color? What does he want to say? God, why did you give me that color? What do you want to say? And write it down. God's not going to speak to you probably with a voice that shakes the air, okay? It's just going to be a whisper, just a hint, just something there. Just write down the first thing that comes to your mind. You don't have to understand it. Just write it down, the first thing that comes to your mind. All right, how many of you got something to write down about what that God had to say? Cool. See, isn't this easy? Isn't this easy? When I was in the Philippines a year ago, let me see, almost a year ago, I did this exercise with people and I did it myself just to time it. And I did it in 3 different cities. And each time God gave me a different color and a different message, and it was the right message for that day. So if you're stuck on something to do to get a conversation with God started, you can start, okay, God, I don't know what to say. Give me a color. And what it does is it just gives you a little starting point for that conversation. Do you ever remember a favorite uncle? Maybe you'd meet with them and they would give you a little candy or something, and it was just a touch point, just to get the conversation started. There's nothing mystical about the color or anything like that. It's just a starting point. It's an easy, easy starting point. Kids can do it, adults can do it, anyone can do this. So I want you to see that it's easy to hear God's voice. Just like for Callie, she couldn't get her head around this little screen, and she could hear a mom's voice, but she couldn't figure it out that was a representation of Ben, and that she could talk to the screen, and Ben could hear her, and Ben was speaking back to her. She couldn't get her head around that for a while, but as her parents kept coaching her, she got it. And that's the same with hearing God. Sometimes it's that you can't quite get your head around it, but with a little bit of coaching and some simple exercises like this, you can get it. You see, the nice thing about the little color example is when you think of a color, it normally doesn't by itself have any strong connotations, okay? And it's doesn't have any moral connections. It's just a random thing, okay? And that's why it's such a nice starting point for hearing God. Okay? Whereas if you ask God for a Bible verse and he gives you a verse, you say, oh, I don't like that verse. Give me another verse. Whereas if he gives you a color, you have no idea what the color means. And so it's easy. Okay, all right. And so you know why you write it down. You write it down because you're committing to that color, okay? And so then God can start to talk to you about that color. And it's, again, there's nothing magic or special about it. It's just an easy way to start a conversation. Maybe you meet somebody somewhere and they're strangers, and for some reason you want to connect with them and you don't know where to start. So you say, hello. And that's that little starting point. That's all these colors are doing, is they're giving you that little starting point so you can start a conversation with God. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this works. For some of you that are left brain people, you might be wondering, so can you tell me a little bit about how this works? And the answer is yes, I can. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. And there we go. Do you see a screen? Oh, oops, let me see here. All right, that's the screen you're supposed to see to start with. Okay, so there is a place in our minds, we could call it the inner self, and that's a place where you have conversations with yourself. Now, if you're having trouble picturing that, just imagine that somebody comes up and hits you hard on the shoulder and you're going, ow, they hurt me. You start having a conversation with yourself, don't you? Oh man, why did they do that? And you know what? The next thing you know, okay, so let me see if I get this to work. There we go. Okay, your thoughts go into that place. And maybe you start to have pictures. Maybe you picture something. Now, the other thing that happens is I'll round that out a little bit more. Maybe the enemy starts to say, you start to think, oh man, I should get back at them. And maybe you start to get a picture of how you can get back at them, or something you could say about them to someone else, okay? And the next thing you know, the enemy comes along and he says, have I got an idea for you? And it's the enemy that's slipping something in. And he doesn't say enemy here. Oh, okay. He just slips it in and says, you're a clever person. Here's a really good idea. And he slips it in, trying to make it appear like one of your ideas. Now, as Christians, we learn to discern the devil. So we know when the devil is speaking to us, and says, that's not my thought, that's the enemy. It's called a temptation, okay? But some people aren't at that point, and they don't recognize it as, if they don't know Jesus, they may not recognize it as a temptation. But you see, the enemy speaks into that same place, and he does that on purpose. So it sounds like your own clever thinking. Now, not surprisingly, that's the same place that God speaks. And that's why it's difficult to discern your voice from God's voice. Now, with practice, you can do it. But initially, so the color that you got, some of you were saying, okay, that's maybe from God, or maybe I just picked a color. But I think maybe if you look back on this in a few days, or your child comes up with the same color pencil, the same color marker as what the color you were thinking, you say, oh, that really was from God. But it was hard to tell that that was really from God in the moment that you got it. And so this is the way that this works. And God sometimes gives you an image or a color or an emotion or a song. I know somebody who often wakes up with a song in the morning, and it might be a secular song. And then they think about those words and, oh, okay, I get the message that God is wanting to send me as I'm waking up this morning. And by the way, when you first wake up in the morning, especially if you can do it without a noisy alarm clock, that's an ideal time to have a little conversation with God. Somehow the heavens are a little thinner during that little time, and it's easier to have a conversation with God. All right, so that's a little bit of a picture of how it works. Yeah, I'd like us to just think for a moment about the pictures and ideas that we have in our own heads. You see, when God speaks, you might say, well, that picture isn't really crystal clear. Well, you know what? If you think about a picture in your own mind, it may not be crystal clear either. Here's an example. I want you to imagine an ice cream cone with ice cream in it. Now, some of you might sort of have a mental picture of the cone, and some of you might have a blob on the top, okay? But some of you will say, oh, I know what it is. It's cherry ice cream, and I can even see the cherries inside, okay? Or whatever your favorite kind is, all right? And so it's the same when you get a message from God. It has very much that same feel. And God may give you a picture, and it will have that same feel. Or if I say to you, I want you to think about this statement, the sky is blue. You see how that sits in your mind? You can't actually trace the letters of it, but the sky is blue. You can hold that in your mind. And when God speaks to us, he often puts those thoughts in our mind, and they have that same quality, that same feel. They don't feel like the earth is shaking and there's this big, big sound, but it's just this, the sky is blue. Maybe that's the message that God wants to give you, or something like that. It'll have that feel. The other thing that's important is when you're asking God for an answer is go with the first thing he gives you. Go with the first thing you hear. Andrew, it was lovely you said as you were asking God for a color before we even finished, the color was in your face, if I can use that expression. God often does that because he knows your thoughts, and so he knows what you're going to ask him. And so he can answer even before the question is done. And to me, that's often a really good sign that that is the answer from God. Because you see, if you ask God, what is something you like about me? He might say something. Maybe he'll say, you're kind and loving. And your mind immediately says, that's too good. I'm not like that. I'm an okay person. Okay. And so your mind starts to replace what God is trying to say to you. And so that's why you need to go with the first thing and get the habit of taking the first thing that comes after you ask God a question and write it down. If you write it down, it helps you to get in the habit of taking that first message. Now, because God can tell us all kinds of things and those things can change our lives, it's important that we test the things that we hear. We don't want to become flaky and just take, oh, some impression came to my mind and I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to whatever, okay? So here are some things that we do when we think we hear God say something to us. And again, I encourage you very much to write it down. Write it down as quickly as you can so you catch exactly the wording of what he says. But when you think you hear something, always test it. Is it consistent with the Bible? If it is not, then it is not from God. It means that the enemy has tried to slip something in, or your imagination has thought up something. That's the first test. The second test, is it confirmed by the Holy Spirit? And the verse there would be John 16:13. Does it build up, encourage, or comfort? If you hear a message and it just makes you feel yucky inside, it's probably not from God. Even if it's said in religious language, okay? Religious language is not a clue that it's from God. That has nothing to do with whether it's from God or not. The question is, does it build up, encourage, or comfort? Does it lead to liberty and spiritual fruit? And there's 4 references for that. Does it draw the hearer closer to Jesus? Now, as I listened to the things that you said this morning, that you heard when you got the color, and then you got a sense of a short message after that, my impression was that in every case, that the message drew the hearer closer to Jesus. That's exactly what it is supposed to do, because this is about relationship. That's the whole point of listening to God. You pick up your spiritual phone and you talk to God and you listen to him, and he talks to you because he wants to draw you closer to himself. The other thing I want to just point out is sometimes you're not sure. You hear something and you're not sure if it's from God. So you know what? Go and talk to a trusted Christian friend. That does not mean that you are not believing what God said, but it simply means that you want to weigh it. And we're told to do that. We're told to get counselors and to test whether something is really from God. We're told again and again and again, test it. And testing it doesn't mean that you are doubting it. It means you're trying to determine if this is from God so that you can actually carry it out. It's kind of again like you're putting the idea on the kitchen table in the middle of the kitchen table, so you don't forget to look at it and test it and decide what to do with it. All right. So then again, listen and ask God and test what He says. All right. So here are some little ideas for staying in touch with God. Here's the first one. When you read your Bible, ask God to speak to you. I almost always do that. And it makes my Bible much more interesting because the guy who wrote it sits beside me and he says, "You see this little piece here? Let me tell you about that." And it just makes it so much more interesting. Or he reminds me about something else somewhere else in the Bible as I'm reading this passage. Or he shows me how that little verse or that passage applies to my life. Or I'm trying to pray for somebody and I don't know how to pray. And he says, "Here's the answer for how to pray for that other person." These are all things that God will do if you ask Him to be near you when you're reading your Bible. A couple of weeks ago, Jake led us in a Lectio Divina. All right, it's very much along that same line. That's the first thing. When you read your Bible, ask God to speak to you. Second thing, take a look at all the passages that are in the handout that you have. One of the sections is called Listening Can Affect Outcomes. And it's about a whole bunch of examples of where God spoke to someone and they paid attention to it and it changed, it saved lives, it protected individuals. In some cases, it changed whole nations and whole cultures. So that's the second thing. The third thing is when you pray, spend half of your time listening. And the fourth thing is find a quiet place and just hang out with God. Ask Him to give you a color or give you the name of an animal or whatever you want to. Have some fun with it. And then use that as a starting point for a conversation with God. Spend half of your, and hang out. Like Serena said, she imagines Jesus sitting on the couch. You know, if you want to do that, imagine Jesus sitting with you, go ahead and do that. Again, we're not being mystical and we're not, we're just using this as a place to help get us started. Okay, to help get the conversation started. Initially, his voice might sound like yours and you might be thinking, is this my voice or is this God's voice? Well, you know what? You'll get it figured out and maybe make some notes on what you hear. And the whole idea of having a conversation, if you want to reference 2 Samuel 5, verses 17 to 25, there are lots of examples in the Bible about people who had conversations with God. It says in Hebrews 15:14, with practice, you learn to discern. So if you want to know, is that really God's voice or mine? With practice, that's how you get it. Hebrews 15 or Hebrews 5, verse 14. All right. How are we doing for time? Okay, we've got a couple minutes yet. Okay, we're going to do two more. Let me think. Yeah, we're going to do two more things here. And so the first one, just quickly, if you look at the handout, there's a section called Riding a Bicycle. And the point it makes is that when you're learning to hear God's voice, it's like learning to ride a bicycle. The first time you ride a bike, you fall off. Or maybe you get 3 feet and then you fall off. And it's okay. And then you get back on and you ride again. And eventually you get really good and you can ride long distances and you can ride up and down hills and over rough territory and stay on the bike. Learning to hear God is like that. You get back on the bike and every time you can go a little bit further. The other thing is that practice is key. And in the handout, there are some nice training exercises. And so I encourage you to do them. And especially pay attention to the journal exercise. Write down what you think you maybe perhaps just, that might be God. Write it down. And you, that will help you to learn to become better at hearing God's voice. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. All right, I want to do one more little exercise with you. And it's a kind of Lectio Divina. And I'm going to read Psalm 23. And just so you know, we're going to have breakout rooms yet today. And so that's why I'm trying to save a block of time at the end here so we can have breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, I'm going to encourage you just to share a time when God spoke to you or you think he spoke to you. And what did you do? Maybe you decided to pay attention and maybe you weren't ready to pay attention and you didn't, all right? And you don't have to share a story, but if you'd like to hear a story, you'd like to hear some other people's stories, that's what we're going to do in the breakout rooms. But before we get there, I'm going to read Psalm 23, and I'm going to encourage you to just close your eyes and just let God talk to you. Imagine, if you want, imagine that God is close to you. Or imagine that you're out in your backyard in the lawn or something and it's a lovely morning or a lovely day, whatever you like. But the point is, get yourself in a place where it's easy for God to speak to you as I read this psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for the sake of his name. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. All right. I hope that the Lord was able to speak to you through that song and that it helps you to see that you can go someplace on your own, find a quiet spot, or maybe in the nighttime, and let the Lord speak to you through passages that you've memorized or passages that he brings to your mind. So as we said at the beginning, our purpose was to make this very practical today. And I hope that the direction I got where the Lord said, I want them to know me. I hope that happened today, that in some way you came to better know God as a result of today.